so I don't fall over. I already struggle with nausea pretty regularly, so this will be better. So we're continuing in the series on John's Gospel, and last week Lynn and I were away. It was a good weekend away. We were in Banff at a retreat, a pastor's retreat, and it was good timing because we've been discerning this role for Lynn. Actually, we've been in the process for almost 2 months probably, and this last weekend was a perfect time to just be praying about it. And Lynn had some good conversations with some people who helped her discern, and some people praying for her, and and so it was a good time, not just for me as a pastor, but for her as in not just a pastor's wife, but now in a pretty important leadership role at Covenant Bay Camp. And that's exciting for me as well. I love camp ministry, and we both do, but if she's not in a church ministry role, then camp is the next best thing, or maybe better. So we were away, and John Peacock spoke from the passage where Jesus turned the water into wine. I was a little bit disappointed that I wasn't speaking on that passage, because it's a pretty interesting little thing to think about. Imagine what was going on there. But the author of the gospel wrote that it was the first sign that Jesus did, through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. That he makes a point to say that this was the first of the signs which revealed his glory, and the disciples believed in him. At the end of his gospel, he wrote, Jesus performed many other signs. He only mentioned 7 miracles that Jesus did, but compared to the other gospels, there were quite a few others. But John said, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. And so, it's one of the unique features of John's gospel that he doesn't include many of the miracles that Jesus performed that are recorded in the other gospels. And yet he included changing the water into wine one. I think it's symbolic, that miracle is symbolic of his transformative power. That he can take something that would have had almost no value, probably wasn't water that was particularly safe to drink. I'm not quite sure what they did to make the water safe to drink. Maybe boiled it or whatever, but they just put water in there, and he turned it in from something that wasn't very useful, especially for the occasion, and he made it useful. And not only useful, but enjoyable. He made it particularly good. As the master of ceremonies, the wedding planner, so to speak, was saying how good the wine was that he made. And now we turn to a very different kind of story. And so let me read from John chapter 2, starting at verse 13. You already heard as I talked to the kids what we're going to be looking at today. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables and exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." His disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then responded to him, "What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." They replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. Now, while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, many people saw the signs he was performing and believed in his name. But Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all people. He did not need any testimony about mankind, for he knew what was in each person. So the story in front of us today is unique within the Gospels. It shows the one time when Jesus seemed to behave somewhat out of character. He's normally quite calm and compassionate and patient and forgiving. But when it comes to those who misrepresent his heavenly Father, he often has strong words, and in this case, strong actions. The story is also unique because of where it is placed in this gospel compared to the other gospels. The others place it at the end of his ministry, and John places it at the beginning. And there's much a person could say about this, and much has been written about it. Scholars speculating about why this is the case. And I don't want to focus on it, so I'll just give you two possible explanations. You can choose either one for yourself, whichever one you think makes the most sense. One explanation is that John is doing what he does all throughout the gospel, and that is to include this story for theological rather than historical purposes. We'll see throughout all of John, it comes up again and again, that he is telling these stories not for the purpose of recording a historical or a chronological biography of Jesus, but a theological one, to show who he is and why he came. And the other possibility is that Jesus cleansed the temple more than once, that he actually did this multiple times. The other Gospels have Jesus only going to Jerusalem once at the end of his 3 years of ministry, at the beginning, or during what we call the Passion Week, the triumphal entry, and then he cleansed the temple, and then he did other things, and it got to the point where people got so sick of him and tired of him making condemning statements against the religious leaders and talking about himself as though he is God, that they killed him. And it's possible, because John has Jesus going to Jerusalem at least 3 times, that Jesus went there at the beginning of his ministry and cleansed the temple that time, and then again at the end of his ministry. It's quite possible that he did that. Now, I don't have a firm decision on which of these two options is the best explanation, maybe both. John is focusing more on the theological side of things than the historical, kind of chronological. And he wants to make a statement about Jesus, who he is, and why he came. And he wanted to do it at the beginning of the story instead of at the end. But it's also quite possible that Jesus did do this twice. And so maybe both is the best answer. Going back to the other reason this story is unique, the fact that it sort of shows Jesus a little bit out of character. I want to address some questions that will come up throughout this message that I'm going to hopefully answer, or at least provide some way of responding to this story, a way of thinking about it. And it'll help us understand the motive and the nature and the goal that Jesus had in cleansing the temple. The motive, the nature, and the goal. Addressing the motive, nature, and goal of Jesus requires us to connect this story to the Old Testament. You have to understand the temple, why it was there. You know, maybe you think you already know this, and you can just nod off for a little bit. But I encourage you to pay attention, because perhaps you haven't connected these dots before. If you read my letter this week, and I know that I can see statistics. I don't see if you individually have read the letter, but I see how many have at least opened the link, and definitely more did this week than most, because I prompted you to. But it was important because it gives a lot of context. So if you didn't get that, if you didn't see it, then I encourage you to do that. And my weekly letter, well, I don't like to call it weekly, because then if I miss a week, then I'm lying. But I'll probably miss this week because I'll be away for a couple of days. But if you're not subscribed to that, what I often do is provide a little extra stuff to my sermons. I got way more stuff than I can. If I had your permission, I could preach for an hour and a half, and then I wouldn't do the letter. Maybe. Yeah, I probably still would. But I could easily, every message could easily be an hour and a half, because there's just so much more to these passages than what I can share in 45 minutes. But if you read my letter this week, then you will have already had an introduction to this subject. I'm not going to rehash all that stuff. But for the ancient people, and not just the Israelites, but any nation, any kingdom, any tribe that claimed to have some sort of deity as their god, anyone who wanted to worship a god would set up a place of worship. So it might be some sort of altar, dedicated to that god, or as fancy and as elaborate as this sort of temple that was built eventually in Jerusalem. And it's important. It was important to them because they believed that the gods would interact with humans through special places. And I've talked about this before. Like, I like to call them portals. That's not an ancient term, but it's sort of a special place where the divine and the physical meet. Special places on the earth, and we see in Jesus' ministry that he's trying to tell people that that's because of him, that's no longer required. We don't have to go to certain places to meet with God. Anyway, so people would set up a temple or a place of worship in these special spots. We visited, well, I didn't get to, but Lynn visited a place. Actually, I did go to one, what was that mountain called? Olympus, Mount Olympus in Greece. And they believed that was where some of the gods lived, on that mountain. Lynn went to another one, and they believed that the gods were there because whenever the goats or the animals would go to a certain place, they would start acting funny. And it turned out it was sulfuric gas, and it was making them high. But so the ancient people thought that, well, this is a special place where the gods, where the divine and the physical met, sort of a thin place, where the difference between heaven and earth is thin. And so then they would set up a temple, a place of worship, in those spots. And in the case of Israel, that place is Jerusalem, or Mount Zion, more specifically. And but God's statements about where and how he dwells on the earth is not limited to a specific location. In fact, when King David told Yahweh that he wanted to build a house for the Lord, Yahweh said to him, this is what the Lord says, "Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in? Have I not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt to this day? I have been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling. Wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to any of their rulers, whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, Why have you not built me a house of cedar?" So this is an interesting idea. And if you kind of track back, all the way back, and this is why I started with the Pentateuch. If you were here a couple years ago, I started with that because it's important to understand, like, God, he has constantly condescended. So he has lowered himself to the level of his people so that they would be able to have fellowship with him. He didn't require them to rise up to his level, but he lowered himself to their level. And he did this initially by giving them instructions on how to build a tabernacle, a portable place of worship that they would have been familiar with because they grew up, they were living as slaves in Egypt where they had similar places of worship. There probably would have been scattered all over the land of Egypt where there would be these temples or places of worship that would have looked very similar to the tabernacle that God gave them. And so he gave them instructions that they would have been familiar with and said, "Oh yeah, this makes sense. This is how we worship our God, Yahweh." The Egyptians worshiped their gods. This is how we're going to worship our God. And so God would meet them at their level, but he didn't require it. It's for the people's benefit. And again, they get to the promised land, to Canaan, and they set up the capital city, Jerusalem, and David builds himself a palace, and he's saying, "I have a palace to live in, but our God is still living in a tent. This is not good." And God says, "It's okay with me." And then he goes on and says, and you will not build this house, your son will. Your son's going to build my house, your son Solomon. And so this house, this temple, was to be constructed according to the plans given by God. So God says, "Okay, so if you're going to build me a house, I'm going to tell you what it's going to look like so that it matches me, my glory and who I am." And so and these instructions are at the end of 1 Chronicles, beginning of 2 Chronicles. You can read them there. It's very interesting reading, lots of details. If you're into details, you might find it interesting. But once the temple was completed, then the presence of the Lord descended. They set up a bunch of sacrifices, and the presence of the Lord in the form of fire descended on the temple and consumed all the sacrifices, and the glory of Yahweh then was there among them. And God appeared to Solomon later and said this, and I'm going to read 2 Chronicles 7, verse 12 to 22. Listen very carefully to this passage. This is really important instruction that God gives to Solomon. And if you know the story of Israel, then you know how things are going to go based on these instructions. So the Lord said, Yahweh said to Solomon, "I have heard your prayer," so the prayer of dedication for the temple, "and have chosen this place for myself as a temple for sacrifices. When I shut up the heavens so that there is no rain, or command locusts to devour the land, or send a plague among my people, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, and I will forgive their sin and will heal their land. Now, my eyes will be open and my ears attentive to the prayers offered in this place. I have chosen and consecrated this temple so that my name may be there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there. As for you, King Solomon, if you walk before me as faithfully as David your father did, and do all I command and observe my decrees and laws, I will establish your royal throne, as I covenanted with David, your father, when I said, you shall never fail to have a successor to rule over Israel. But if you turn away and forsake the decrees and commands I have given you, and go off to serve other gods and worship them, then I will uproot Israel from my land, which I have given them, and will reject this temple I have consecrated for my name. I will make it a byword and an object of ridicule among all peoples. This temple will become a heap of rubble. All who pass by will be appalled and say, 'Why has the Lord done such a thing to this land and to this temple?' People will answer, 'Because they have forsaken the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who brought them out of Egypt, and have embraced other gods, worshiping and serving them. That is why he has brought all this disaster on them.'" So, if you know the story of Israel, you know that that's exactly what happened. The temple became a heap of rubble because of their disobedience, because they sought after other gods. And it didn't even take very long. Solomon chased after other gods, and his sons divided Israel into two nations. Solomon was the last king to rule over united Israel. But God promised that the day would come when he would return to Zion and will dwell once again in Jerusalem. But this will be a renewed Jerusalem, one that is known for truth and faithfulness. This is God's desire for his dwelling place. And it is why Jesus is so passionate about the temple. At the end of the message, we'll participate in communion together. And in preparation for communion, as I go through the rest of this message, consider the following statement about the motive and the nature and goal of Jesus in cleansing the temple. The temple was a place of fellowship, to join with other people who want to worship Yahweh, and to enjoy the grace and the blessing and the presence of God. The measure of success for the temple was relational. It was all about relationship. It was about relationship between God and his people and between his people and each other. It was also relationship between Israel and the foreign people. They were not to reject foreigners. They were welcome to come. They had a special place at the temple courts, the place where Jesus drove out the market, the sellers and the money changers. That's where the foreigners could come. So God's intention for the temple was that it be a place of good fellowship, of good relationship between him and the people and each other and other nations. But those who were responsible for the temple lost sight of that. Their measure of success went from God's intention for the temple to a secular measure of success. Success for God has always been about relationship, but success in the secular world is always about numbers, about more and faster and accumulation and power and control. Success for God, holiness and right living is about extending and accepting forgiveness, love, and God's blessing, receiving the unlimited supply of God's goodness and expanding his goodness everywhere we go. So, as we enter into this story and as it enters into us, let us consider what we might need to change in our lives individually and communally so that we can reflect God's good purpose for us, his people, while we worship him and while we share his goodness for others. So to understand Jesus' motive, think carefully about what is said in verse 14. What did Jesus find in the temple? What was there? The kids know, they see it on their page. What's in the temple there? Money. What else? Cattle? Sheep? Is that all? Birds. Yes. Money, cattle, sheep, and birds. He found people selling these things, and this is kind of necessary. People were traveling a long distance, and if they would have brought their sacrifice from a long distance, then it's possible that the sheep or the cattle, whatever they're bringing, could get injured, could get stolen, could get sick, whatever, and then they would have nothing to offer. So then God would make exception and say, if you can't bring a sacrifice, then you can actually bring money to the temple and make an offering that way. And so, but the leaders of the temple made a rule that basically said you can't bring just normal currency, you have to bring the temple currency. They had a special currency that was accepted at the temple. And so if you brought a foreign currency, then you had to go and get it exchanged. And if you didn't bring a sacrifice, then you could go buy a sacrifice. And this is all fine. This isn't what is being condemned. What Jesus is concerned about is that this is happening in the temple courts. Like there's other places this could be done, but it's happening in the temple courts. And so this is the thing that Jesus is concerned about. He says in verse 16, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." In Mark's gospel, he adds in Mark 11, verse 17, "My house will, is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations? But you have made it a den of robbers." And so perhaps Jesus was upset because they were taking advantage of people. They're giving an unfair exchange rate or selling the animals at an inflated rate. But in John's gospel, he's only concerned with the fact that this stuff is happening in the temple courts. You see, the whole temple environment was turned from an environment of prayer, relationship, worship, into a busy market. It's easy to draw a parallel from the temple to our church buildings. And this is often how people immediately think, well, let's not turn our place of worship into a marketplace. And people get worried about that. Fair enough. I mean, probably we should be mindful of that. But let's not forget that it is not this building or church buildings or places of worship that is a replacement for the temple. That's not what happened. We didn't go from having the temple as God's dwelling place to now these buildings as God's dwelling place. We went from the temple being God's dwelling place to us being his dwelling place. He lives in us. We are his temple. So, our very hearts, our minds, and our bodies are where God lives for those who have accepted Christ and have new life in him. So if we're to make a connection from what Jesus did in the temple to what he wants to do today, we need to examine ourselves. Not necessarily how we do our worship. I mean, of course, we should always examine that and be thoughtful about it, but examine our hearts, our behavior. And we need to hear Jesus' words, "Get these out of here, stop turning my Father's house into a market," as speaking to us, his people, to our hearts and our minds and our bodies. So a question is, how do we get, and what is it? What is it that, the marketplace? So we can draw all kinds of parallels, and I'm not going to get too far into that. I want to leave you with something to think about. But consider, what is it in your life that has turned it from a place of prayer to a marketplace? You can all probably think of something. We'll have some time here at the end as we prepare for communion to do that. So, let's look now at the nature of the cleansing, which includes a statement that sort of bridges both the motive and the nature. It says that his disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." So he's quoting Psalm 69. And this is a commentary added, John and or his disciples or both, they sort of were making commentaries, adding commentaries all throughout the gospel to say this is what we have come to believe as the community of Christians as the church. We've come to believe this. And so these commentary little pieces are added to the story to say, look at Psalm 69. This is what's happening. Jesus has so much zeal, so much passion for God's dwelling place, his house, which again, remember, was the temple and is now us. So much passion that it would consume him. Or another way to understand that word is it would destroy him. And I take a little bit of liberties. I saw some commentators say stuff about this. I think it's okay to draw this connection, but Jesus is so passionate about God dwelling. He wants God to dwell among his people. And he's so passionate about that it literally took him to death. It took him to the grave. That his death is because he wants God to dwell among us and within us. And that's exactly what his death did. Actually, it was both the death and the resurrection that made that possible. And so that sort of bridges both the nature and the motive of the cleansing. But the nature of the cleansing is that of holy passion. Holy passion. And we need to be careful with how we think about the actions of Jesus in this story. Like I've heard some pastors and some preachers talk about Jesus, taking a whip and he's like whipping people. I doubt he actually whipped anybody. I actually, on that little drawing I did, I drew the whip in there by hand because it's not very long. It probably wasn't like a big, long thing. It was just enough to get the animals moving and to make a point that he didn't want these people in there. He was driving them out. And unfortunately, many pastors and Christians in general have used this story as justification to get angry. I can tell you, I would never be able to call myself holy enough to justify my anger. I just can't. I try to stay as far away from expressing my anger to people as possible because I know I don't have it in me to do it in a holy and righteous way. But Jesus did. And he was so passionate about God's presence being among them, it drove him to do something that probably none of us should ever do. But yet, I've seen pastors, there's one pastor in particular that loves to yell at his congregation and just he goes on, I don't even know where he gets these ideas from, but I get to watch, I laugh. I feel sorry for his congregation, but it's almost comical. He once went off on facial hair for men and how shameful it was for men to be growing beards. And I think I've heard him say over and over again about Jesus turning the tables, and he's just turning the tables just like Jesus did. These pastors, they can get mad about wearing certain clothes or having certain hairstyles or not giving enough or, oh, you're falling asleep again, I'm going to yell at you for falling asleep during my sermon. I want to yell at him for being so boring that people are falling asleep. It's so far, that sort of behavior is so far from what Jesus was doing. He was always very compassionate and kind to people who wanted to come to him, who were seeking the presence and the fellowship of God. It was the people who thought they had it and didn't need forgiveness and didn't need God's grace that Jesus got mad at. And so if you're coming here seeking after Jesus, he's compassionate toward you. He's kind toward you. He's not mad at you because of your sin. He wants to forgive you and he wants to embrace you. But if we were, hypothetically, to express the sort of zeal that Jesus had if there was any situation where, if you were called to do it, my guess is that God would not call you to do it in a church, but that he would bring you to the places and the people who are using their power and wealth only for their own advantage. And maybe there's some churches out there that are doing this, but more than likely, as one commentator says, that if we applied this today, it would be at the law courts and legislative assemblies. It would be at the royal palaces and banking centers, the places where power is so often wielded to the benefit of the already powerful and the downtreading of the already powerless, the places where people with power or wealth turn in on themselves instead of outwards in generosity toward the world. Those are the places, because that's what was going on in the temple. The people who controlled the temple were so protective of their power, of their position and their privilege. Yet we must be wise in how we apply this story to our context. The first application, and perhaps for most or maybe all of us, the only application of this story, is for us to ask how we are guilty of making God's dwelling place a marketplace. How am I guilty of making my heart, my mind, my body a dwelling place for the market, consumerism, and whatever else I do to corrupt his dwelling place? If we think about where the money changing and selling was happening, which was mainly inside the temple courts, which is called the court of the Gentiles. The Gentiles were not allowed to go further into the temple, so those who wanted to come and see and receive God, maybe they wanted to convert to Judaism and they wanted to enter into the temple to pray or to seek a rabbi, someone to teach them. Instead of being a place of prayer where they could focus on the glory of God and his grace for them, they were bombarded with a marketplace. The rulers of the temple lost sight of the purpose of the temple. This was supposed to be a house of prayer for all nations, not just for the elite. It's for everybody. And this upset Jesus. He scattered the tables, disrupted the entire market, and probably drew a lot of attention. So what was his goal? What was the goal of the cleansing? The short answer to that question is, it was to send a message. It was a prophetic and a messianic message. In other words, as a prophet and Messiah, Jesus was acting and speaking on behalf of God. He wanted people to wake up to what God was doing among them. They had lost sight. When the Jews asked him to show them a sign to prove that he had authority to do such a thing, Jesus said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." He was saying that even if the temple was destroyed, the presence of God would still be among them, because he was among them. He was right there in front of them, and they didn't see. I imagine Jesus looking at them with fire in his eyes, challenging them to abandon the center of their identity, the temple, to give up the temple structure in exchange for the true presence of God. This wasn't Jesus condemning the temple. This was Jesus condemning the people for making a temple their God. John makes the comment that Jesus was speaking of the temple of his body. Whether or not he was making a prediction about that they would kill him and he would rise from the dead within 3 days, the point was to speak prophetically about the true nature of God's presence. The temple had long been a sign for the Jews of Yahweh being in their midst. But instead, the temple became a place where they didn't worship God, but they worshiped the temple itself, the identity that they had by having this glorious temple. Instead of it being a place where they met with God, it became the object of their worship. And we can do a similar thing today. It could be a certain style of music, or church liturgy, or even the Bible itself can be the object of our worship. We can turn what is meant to be a way to connect with God into the object of our worship. And so to properly learn from this story, we need to examine ourselves. Not just how we perform our worship service or maintain our building, what songs we sing and so on, or to get out into the public spaces and protest against corruption. Now, those things may be involved in our response, but the first and primary response is to examine ourselves. That's how it works with all of Scripture. Before you do anything, before you think of anything else, the first question is, how does God want to change me through this passage, through this story? And this sort of examination needs to be embodied and enacted, not just understood. The concern of Jesus was that the people turned God's dwelling place into a marketplace. And I'm tempted, by way of application, to give you examples of how we might do the same thing with God's dwelling place, our being. You know, I could give you a list of examples, but I want you to reflect on that. How have you turned God's temple, which is yourself, into a marketplace? And so what we're going to do for the next several minutes is we're going to take time to reflect in preparation for communion. If you're unfamiliar with the practice of communion and you're unsure if you want to participate, you're welcome to just observe. But if you're a follower of Jesus or you want to be, then come. There's no condition. The only condition is that you want it. So I'm going to read a guided prayer, and as you listen, consider how God might want you to respond. And once I'm done, you're welcome to come, and we're going to serve one another. This is going to be more of an interactive communion. I'm going to serve the first person, which I think is going to be Doris, and she's going to play piano. She's going to serve the next person, and as we go, I think there's a few plates that we have here. You just serve each other. It'd be nice if everybody would serve another person, kids included. Let's serve each other. And as you take the elements, instead of taking them back to your seats, consume them right there. That's most logistical. Consume them, take the plates from the person who served you, and then serve the next person, and then they consume them, and so on. Does that make sense? So we're going to serve one another. All are welcome. So, let's pray.